नमस्कार सबको, मैं जैसिका हूँ और लोग मुझसे हमेशा पूछते हैं कि आप क्यों और कैसे हिंदी सीखी. The most common question that I get asked by Indians is, why do you live in India? And why did you put in the effort to learn Hindi? What was the process of becoming fluent in Hindi as an American person? Before I answer that, welcome to the Invisible India podcast. This is our first ever video podcast. Many listeners were requesting it so that we move over to YouTube, so I hope that you enjoy. आज मैं सबसे पहला वीडियो पॉडकास्ट बना रही हूँ. I am not lip syncing. मैंने किसी प्लेबैक सिंगर को हायर नहीं किया है ये ऑडियो देने के लिए. ये मेरा अपना शब्द है. This is not meant to be an exact word-for-word translation. I'm just expressing my thoughts naturally as they come to me. So, let's ask the first question. Why did I learn Hindi? तो आज मैं पहला सवाल का उत्तर देने वाली हूँ. हिंदी क्यों सीखी? I came to India 14 years ago for an internship, and I was very fascinated with Indian culture from the get-go. I was far outside a metropolitan area, and I realized quickly that even though a lot of people spoke English, their heart language was in their original Indian language. And for where I was living in northern India, that was Hindi. तो मैं 14 साल पहली बार भारत में आई इंटर्नशिप के लिए, और शुरू से मुझे भारतीय संस्कृति बहुत पसंद आई. और मैं काफ़ी बड़े शहर से बहुत दूर थी. My motivation behind learning was really for deepening friendships and relationships. Hindi in and of itself isn't a language that you would necessarily call a business language, but it is a social language. I didn't come into it wanting to necessarily advance my career or improve myself, although these were certainly outcomes that occurred. My initial motivation was to get to know people and, if possible, help people. मैं अपने लिए हिंदी नहीं सीखी, बल्कि इसलिए कि अपने फ्रेंड्स को समझूं, भारतीय संस्कृति को गहराई से पहचानूं. I didn't come into it thinking that, I want to become bilingual or use a language for my resume, although there's nothing wrong with that, or just learning a language for fun because you like learning. But it happened for me naturally because I was fully present to experience it. India का पूरा अनुभव लेने के लिए सीखी. I remember one evening I was staying at a friend's house. As girls do in India, we were 3 of us squeezed into one small bed. One girl was crying at 3 a.m., explaining what was happening, and I could only assume it was about her upcoming marriage, which she was having arranged, and she didn't want to go through with it. I had no idea what she was saying, but I knew that I couldn't comfort her properly or even be included in the conversation because I didn't understand the language, and that emotional connection wasn't going to come unless I understood more of the language. We could have a business conversation, but a real close relationship wouldn't happen unless I learned Hindi. एक बार की कहानी बताती हूँ. लगभग 14 साल पहले मैं अपने फ्रेंड्स के साथ थी और एक दूसरी सहेली के घर पे रुकी थी, और हम 3 लड़कियाँ एक बेड में लेटे हुए थे, और मेरी फ्रेंड रो के दूसरी लड़की को उसके होने वाली शादी के बारे में बता रही थी, और वो शादी नहीं करना चाहती थी. लेकिन मैं कुछ समझ नहीं सकी और कुछ बोल नहीं सकी. हम लोग ऑफिस में बहुत बातें करते थे, पर अपने पर्सनल लाइफ के बारे में शेयर नहीं कर पाते थे. To understand the beauty of Hindi, we need to deepen ourselves into relationships with Indians. Hindi is a relational language, and that's when the complexity and true beauty of India is revealed. हिंदी की सुंदरता समझने के लिए Indians के साथ गहरा संबंध होना ज़रूरी है. My friend Nancy, who is about 75 years old and an English teacher, is learning Hindi, has been for a long time, and she wrote to me and asked me this question. I want to read it for you. How do you, Jessica, manage to surmount the influences that would have kept you from being proficient in Hindi? I know a lot of international marriages in which English simply holds sway, and that's it. And not to constantly be freaking out about what seems to be missing in the other culture. Yes, I know you have your complaints about Indian life, but here I'm considering an attitude that transcends the difference. So how do we develop an attitude that transcends the difference? I won't make any blanket statements for everyone, but I know that just for me, accepting India for what it is without trying to change it or change people really helped me to have a better attitude of learning and not comparing India too much to America. अमेरिका और इंडिया को ज़्यादा तुलना करना बेकार है. दोनों अपने तरीके में सुंदर है और दोनों अपने तरीके में खराब है. Another thing I would say is dropping dualistic thinking. I've talked about this on other episodes, but dualistic thinking is basically the temptation to think in a very black and white manner. Yes or no. We in the West are taught this and condition this in a very linear model. It's not a bad thing, but to understand another culture, much like India, one has to adopt a level of multidimensional thinking. Being able to see and appreciate the complexities, allowing your mind to become flexible and moldable. It helps you in learning a language, but it's also helped by learning another language. So it's a bit of a catch-22. The more you learn another language and understand about a culture, the more you will naturally be able to shed this black and white kind of thinking. To be honest, it is still a mystery to me how I learned Hindi. And some people try for years under very similar circumstances and don't get as far. But in this episode, I've done my best to explain the situation and the mentality that I adopted to take a posture of learning. We can all come at things in different ways and try our best, and we may get different results. But not putting in the effort will definitely get us nowhere. So I hope this episode has been helpful. और आज तक मैं पूरा नहीं समझती हूँ कि मैं हिंदी कैसे सीखी. How did I actually go about the process of learning Hindi? What were the techniques and tricks that I used? That I will save for another episode. But before I conclude, I wanted to give a nod to one of my friends, John with Hindi Unlocked. The creator, John, and I were part of the same batch about 14, 15 years ago of early people who were going through a similar program and trying to learn Hindi, and John's been very successful at creating a very systematic approach to learning Hindi. So I really recommend his stuff. And if you haven't checked out the 30-day free Hindi challenge, go ahead to hindiunlock.com and watch the videos that walk through beginner level Hindi. He also has courses for intermediate level speaking, learning Devanagari script, and a bunch of other stuff. So if you do sign up for their course, go ahead and use the code INVISIBLEINDIA and get a 10% discount off of any of their courses. He is offering that to listeners of the Invisible India podcast exclusively. So, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. अगर आपको ये वीडियो पसंद आई तो आप अपने फ्रेंड्स के साथ शेयर कीजिए, लाइक कीजिए और सब्सक्राइब कीजिए. iTunes, Spotify, JioSaavn, Gaana और Google Play भी देखिए. These are all places where the Invisible India podcast can be found. So thank you so much for listening, and be sure to listen to our next episode in which I talk about the tips and tricks of how I learned Hindi. धन्यवाद.